Okay, now we're on part 4 of the old nurse's story. I can't help it, dear Hester, said she, crying. If they did not, I never looked at her feet. But she held my hand fast and tight, and her little one, and it was very, very cold. She took me up the fell path, up to the holly trees, and there I saw a lady weeping and crying. But when she saw me, she hushed her weeping and smiled very proud and grand, and took me on her knee and began to lull me to sleep. And that's all, Hester. But that is true, and my dear mamma knows it is, said she, crying. So I thought the child was in a fever and pretended to believe her, as she went over her story over and over again, and always the same. At last, Dorothy knocked at the door with Mrs. Rosamond's breakfast, and she told me the old ladies were down in the eating parlor and they wanted to speak to me. They had both been into the night nursery the evening before, but it was after Mrs. Rosamond was asleep, so they had only looked at her, not asked me any questions. I shall catch it, thought I to myself, as I went along the north gallery, and yet I thought, taking courage, it was in their charge. I left her, and it's they that's to blame for letting her steal away unknown and unwatched. So I went in boldly and told my story. I told it all to Mrs. Furnivall, shouting it close to her ear. But when I came to the mention of the other little girl out in the snow, coaxing and tempting her out and wheeling her up to the grand and beautiful lady by the holly tree, she threw her arms up, her old and withered arms, and cried aloud, "Oh, heaven, forgive me, have mercy." Miss Stark took hold of her roughly enough. Get your foot off the camera, cat. Rough enough, I thought, but she was past Miss Stark's management and spoke to me in a kind of wild warning and authority. Hester, kept her from that Hester, keep her from that child. It will lure her to her death, that evil child. Tell her it is a wicked, naughty child. Then Miss Stark hurried me out of the room, where, indeed, I was glad enough to go. But Mrs. Furnivall kept shrieking out, "Oh, have mercy! Wilt thou never forgive? It is many a long year ago." I was very uneasy in my mind after that. I durst never leave Mrs. Rosamond night or day, for fear lest she might slip off again after some fancy or other, but all the more because I thought I could make out that Mrs. Furnivall was crazy for their odd ways about her, and I was afraid lest something of the same kind, which might be in the family, hung over my darling. And the great frost never ceased all this time, and whenever it was a more stormy night than usual, between the gusts and through the wind, we heard the same old Lord playing on the great organ. But old Lord or not, whenever Mrs. Rosamond went there, I followed, for my love for her pretty helpless orphan was stronger than my fear for the grand and terrible sound. Besides, it rested with me to keep her cheerful and merry, as beseemed her age. So we played together and wandered together here and there and everywhere, for I never dared to lose sight of her again in that large and rambling house. And so it happened that one afternoon, not long after Christmas Day, we were playing together on the billiard table in the great hall. Not that we knew the way of playing, but she liked to roll the smooth ivory balls with her pretty hands, and I liked to do whatever she did. And by, without her noticing it, it grew dusk indoors, though it was still light in the open air, and I was thinking of taking her back into the nursery, when all of a sudden she cried out, "Look, Hester, look! There is my poor little girl out in the snow." I turned toward the long, narrow windows, and there, sure enough, was a little girl, less than my Mrs. Rosamond, dressed all unfit to be out of doors such a bitter night, crying and beating against the window panes as if she wanted to be let in. She seemed to sob and wail till Mrs. Rosamond could bear it no longer, and was flying to the door to open it, when all of a sudden, and close up upon us, the great organ pealed out so loud and thundering, it fairly made me tremble. and all the more when I remembered me that even in the stillness of the dead cold weather, I had heard no sound of little girl battering her hands upon the window glass, although the phantom child had been seen to put forth all its force. And although I had seen it wail and cry, no faintest touch of sound had fallen upon my ears. Whether I remembered all this at the very moment, I do not know. The great organ sound had so stunned me into terror, but this I know: I caught up Mrs. Rosamond before she got to the hall door, opened and clutched her, and carried her away, kicking and screaming, into the large, bright kitchen, where Dorothy and Agnes were busy with their mince pies. "What is the matter with my sweet one?" cried Dorothy, as I bore in. Mrs. Rosamond was sobbing as if her heart was about to break. "She won't let me open the door for my little girl to come in, and she'll die if she's out on the fells all night. Cruel, naughty Hester," she said, slapping me. But she might have struck harder, for I had seen a look of ghastly horror on Dorothy's face which made my very blood run cold. "Shut the back kitchen door fast and bolt it well," said she to Agnes. She said no more. She gave me raisins and almonds to quiet Mrs. Rosamond, but she sobbed about the little girl in the snow and would not touch any of the good things. I was thankful when she cried herself to sleep in bed. Then I stole down to the kitchen and told Dorothy I had made up my mind I would carry my darling back to my father's house in Applethwaite, where if we lived humbly, we lived at peace. I said I had been frightened enough with the old Lord's organ playing, and now that I had seen for myself the little moaning child, all decked out as no child in the neighborhood could be, beating and battering to get in, yet always without any sound or noise, with the dark wound on its right shoulder, and that Mrs. Rosamond had known it again for the phantom that had nearly lured her to her death, which Dorothy knew was true, I would stand it no longer. I saw Dorothy change color once or twice when I had done. She told me she did not think I could take Mrs. Rosamond with me, for that she was my lord's ward, and I had no right over her, and she asked me would I leave the child that I was so fond of just for sounds and sights that could not do me no harm, and that they had all had to get used to in their turns. I saw all in a hot, trembling passion, and I said it was very well for her to talk that knew what these sights and noises betokened, and that had perhaps had something to do with this spectre child while it was alive, and I taunted her so that she told me all she knew at last, and then I wished I had never been told, for it only made me afraid more than ever. She said she had heard the tale from old neighbors that were alive when she was first married, when folks used to come to the hall sometimes before it got such a bad name on the countryside. It might not be true, or it might, what she had been told. The old lord was Mrs. Furnivall's father, Mrs. Grace, as Dorothy called her. For Mrs. Furnivall was for Mrs. Maud was the elder, and Mrs. Furnivall by rights. The old lord was eaten up with pride. Such a proud man was never seen or heard of, and his daughters were like him. No one was good enough to wed them, although they had choice enough, for they were the great beauties of their day, as I had seen by their portraits were. They hung in the state drawing room, as the old saying is, pride will have a fall, and these two haughty beauties fell in love with the same man, and he no better than a foreign musician whom their father had down from London to play music with them at the manor house. For above all things, next to his pride, the Lord loved music. He could play on nearly every instrument that ever was heard of, and it was a strange thing. It did not soften him, and he was a fierce, dour old man, and had broken his poor wife's heart with his cruelty. He said he was mad after music and would pay any money for it. So he got this foreigner to come who made such beautiful music that they said the very birds on the trees stopped their singing to listen. And by degrees, this foreign gentleman got such a hold over the Lord that nothing would sever him, but that he must come every year. And it was he that had the great organ brought from Holland and built up in the house, up in the hall, where it stood now. He taught the Lord to play on it, but many and many a time when Lord Furnivall was thinking of nothing but his fine organ and his finer music, the dark foreigner was walking abroad in the woods with one of the young ladies, Mrs. Maud and then Mrs. Grace. Mrs. Maud won the day and carried off the prize, such as it was, and he and she were married, all unknown to anyone, and before he made his next yearly visit, he had been confined to a little girl at the farmhouse on the moors, while her father and Mrs. Grace thought she was away at Doncaster races. But though she was a wife and a mother, she was not a bit softened, but was as haughty and as passionate as ever, and perhaps more so, for she was jealous of Mrs. Grace, to whom her foreign husband paid a deal of court, by way of blinding her, as he told his wife. But Mrs. Grace triumphed over Mrs. Maud, and Mrs. Maud grew fierce and fiercer, both with her husband and with her sister, and the former, who could easily shake off what was disagreeable and hide himself in foreign countries, went away a month before his usual time that summer, and half threatened that he would never come back again. Meanwhile, the little girl was left at the farmhouse, and her mother used to have her horse saddled and gallop wildly over the hills to see her once every week, at the very least. For where she loved, and where she hated. And the old Lord went on playing on his organ, and the servants thought the sweetest music he made had soothed down his awful temper, of which Dorothy said some terrible tales could be told. He grew infirm too, and had to walk with a crutch. And his son, that was the present Lord Furnivall's father, was with the army in America, and the other son at sea. So Mrs. Maud had it pretty much her own way, and she and Mrs. Grace grew colder and bitterer to each other every day, till at least they hardly ever spoke, except when the old Lord was by. We're going to stop there, and I'll read the rest when we come back. Let's see him for part 4.